This chain is calling my name.
Follow me if you want to live.
She unbuttoned 2 buttons on her work shirt, pulled the tie out of her hair, picked up a glass of whiskey she had poured with shaking hands, and walked out from behind the bar toward a man she had seen put a grown man on his knees 3 weeks ago. His girlfriend was sitting next to him. 2 armed men were standing behind the booth. 40 people were watching. She leaned in close, wrapped 2 fingers around the silver chain on his neck, and whispered something in his ear that made the amusement drain from his face and something cold and terrified replace it. The vault sat 40 feet below a parking garage on Michigan Avenue in downtown Detroit. No sign on the door. No name on the building. Just a steel elevator that only moved if you had a code, and a hallway lined with black marble that opened into a lounge where the most dangerous men in the city drank whiskey and decided who lived comfortably and who didn't. Nola Beckett had been bartending there for 7 months. She was 22 years old, a third-year biology student at Wayne State, and she had taken the job because it paid $400 a night in cash, and she had a 16-year-old brother at home who needed braces, school supplies, and someone who remembered to buy groceries. Their mother had passed 2 years ago. Ovarian cancer. Nola had spent the last 14 months of her mother's life memorizing symptoms, tracking medications, watching skin color shift and pupils dilate and hands tremble before anyone in the room knew something had changed. That was the thing about Nola. She noticed what other people missed. She always had. Tonight was a Saturday. The lounge was full. Low amber lighting, leather booths, the kind of jazz that sounded expensive. Nola was behind the bar doing what she always did. Pouring drinks. Memorizing faces. Staying invisible. She had learned early that the safest thing a woman could be in a room full of powerful men was forgettable. So she kept her hair pulled back, her shirt buttoned to the collar, her voice low, and her eyes busy. Beck Harlan was in his usual booth in the far corner. He was 34 years old and he ran an empire that stretched across Detroit's ports, logistics lines, and real estate corridors. He didn't need to announce himself when he walked into a room. The room announced him. Conversations got quieter. Postures changed. People who had been laughing suddenly remembered how to sit up straight. He wore dark suits that fit like they were sewn onto his body and a thick silver chain around his neck that caught the light every time he shifted. That chain never came off. Nola had heard one of the servers whisper once that it belonged to his late father. She didn't know if that was true, but she knew that no one ever touched it. Maren Cole was beside him tonight. She always was. 29, tall, dark-haired, and stunning in the way that made other women stop mid-sentence when she walked past. Maren sat next to Beck like she had personally designed the booth for the two of them. Her hand rested on his arm. Her laugh carried across the room with the confidence of a woman who believed the most dangerous man in the building belonged to her. She was bold, sharp-tongued, and territorial. Nola had once watched Maren stare down a woman who accidentally brushed against Beck's shoulder on the way to the restroom. The woman had practically run back to her table. Maren didn't even need to speak. Her eyes did it for her. Nola was polishing a glass when she saw it. Beck reached for his whiskey and lifted it toward his mouth. His hand trembled. Not the kind of tremble that comes from too many drinks. This was a micro-tremor. Quick, involuntary, originating from the wrist. She had studied neurotoxicology last semester. She had read about cumulative low-dose poisoning agents and the way they break down the nervous system in stages before anything shows up on a standard blood panel. The tremor was stage 2. She set the glass down slowly and looked harder. His lips were discolored. Just barely. A faint bluish undertone along the edges that didn't match the warm lighting or the amount he had been drinking. His eyes were glassy in a specific way that she had only seen once before, in a case study about thallium exposure. He blinked too slow. His jaw was tight like he was clenching against something he couldn't identify. Someone was poisoning Beck Harlan. Not fast. Not enough to kill him tonight. But enough to kill him inside a month if it kept going. Small doses. Repeated. Hidden in what he drank, probably. Nola's hands went cold behind the bar. She looked at the table. She looked at who was sitting near him. She looked at who had poured his last drink. And her eyes landed on Frank Duvall. Frank was 52. He had been with Beck since the beginning. He was always nearby, always calm, always watching with that patient half-smile that made people trust him immediately. He was sitting 3 seats from Beck with a glass of water in his hand and an expression that looked like nothing at all. That was what scared her. Everyone else in the room had a reaction to Beck. Fear, respect, tension, performance. Frank had none of that. Frank looked like a man who already knew how the evening was going to end. Nola's pulse was hammering in her throat now. She gripped the edge of the bar and tried to think. She couldn't walk up to Beck Harlan. She couldn't. She had watched what happened to people who approached him wrong. 3 weeks ago, right here in this lounge, a man had stood up from his booth and challenged Beck over a territory line on the east side. He had been loud about it. Brave. Stupid. Beck had stood up slowly and the fight lasted maybe 11 seconds. Nola had watched the whole thing from behind the bar. The man ended up on his knees with blood between his teeth, saying sorry over and over while Beck adjusted his cuffs and sat back down and finished his drink like he had just swatted a fly. That was the man she was thinking about approaching. That was the man whose chain she would have to reach for. The thought made her hands shake. But if she did nothing, he would be dead in weeks. She would go home, go to class, pour drinks at this bar, and one night someone would mention that Beck Harlan had collapsed. That his body had simply given out. And she would know. She would carry it in her chest for the rest of her life that she had seen it happening and she had been too scared to open her mouth. She couldn't live with that. So she started thinking. She couldn't go to him with urgency. If she walked up with panic on her face, his men would intercept her before she got within 5 feet. And if the poisoner saw her approach with any kind of seriousness, the plan would shift. Whoever was doing this would adjust, cover their tracks, maybe accelerate the dose. She had to get to Beck without anyone in the room realizing she had something important to say. She looked at Maren, still draped against his side. She looked at the way the other women in the lounge moved around that table. The only women who got close to Beck without being stopped were the ones bringing something. A drink. A smile. An offering. Nola exhaled slowly and something shifted behind her eyes. She poured a clean drink. Whiskey neat. She had memorized his order months ago. She unbuttoned the top button of her black work shirt. Then the second one. Her fingers were trembling but she kept going. She pulled the tie out of her hair and let it fall past her shoulders. She looked at herself in the mirrored wall behind the bottles and barely recognized the woman staring back. She picked up the glass. She stepped out from behind the bar. And she walked toward the most dangerous man in the room. Every step felt wrong. She was trying to move the way she had seen confident women move. Hips shifted slightly, shoulders back, chin lifted. She had never walked like this in her life. She was a biology student who wore sneakers to class and studied in the campus library until closing time. But from across the room, from a distance, through the amber haze of the lounge, it read like something else. It read like a woman with a purpose that had nothing to do with saving a life. Beck's men clocked her. 2 of them glanced up, then glanced away. She was carrying a drink. She worked here. She was just doing her job with a little more confidence than usual. Nobody reached for a weapon. Nobody stood. Maren saw her coming. Her eyes narrowed slowly, and her fingers tightened on Beck's arm. Nola didn't look at her. She couldn't afford to. One wrong glance and the whole performance would collapse. She reached the table. She set the glass down in front of Beck with a soft smile that she had never practiced and never planned. He looked up at her. His eyes moved across her face, her hair, the open buttons of her shirt. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The slight tilt of his head said he was curious. And then Nola did the thing that no one in that room had ever done. She leaned in close. Close enough that the smell of his cologne filled her lungs and her heartbeat was so loud she was sure he could hear it. She reached up with her right hand and wrapped 2 fingers around his silver chain. The metal was warm from his skin. She pulled it gently toward her. Like a woman who had done this 100 times. She hadn't. She had never touched a man like this in her life. Beck's jaw tightened for just a second. And then a slow, amused smile spread across his face. He thought she was flirting. His eyes dropped to her lips and he leaned back slightly in the booth, entertained, like this was the most interesting thing that had happened to him all night. One of his men smirked. Maren's grip on the table turned her knuckles white. Nola leaned in the rest of the way. Her lips were beside his ear. Her fingers were still wrapped around the chain. Her voice came out as a whisper so quiet that only he could hear it. Someone at this table is killing you. The tremor in your hand. The color on your lips. You're being poisoned. Slowly. Follow me if you want to live more years alive. The smile didn't leave his face all at once. It drained. Slowly. Like someone had pulled a plug at the bottom of it. His jaw stopped moving. His eyes changed. The amusement left them and something colder, sharper, more dangerous replaced it. He didn't look at her like a woman anymore. He looked at her like a threat or a lifeline and he couldn't tell which. 3 full seconds of silence passed between them. The room kept moving. The jazz kept playing. Maren was staring at the side of Nola's face with an expression that could have cut glass. But in the space between Beck and Nola, the world had gone completely still. He stood up. He didn't explain anything to Maren. He didn't nod to his men. He didn't finish his drink. He just stood, and his height swallowed the space between them, and he followed her toward the back corridor like she had just said the only words that mattered. Maren watched them disappear through the staff door. Her face didn't move, but her eyes did. The corridor behind the lounge was narrow and cold. Concrete walls. A single overhead light buzzing at the end. Nola was 3 steps ahead of him when she felt his hand close around her arm. Not rough. Controlled. He turned her and pressed her back against the wall. His forearm came up near her head. His face was inches from hers. And every ounce of that amusement from 30 seconds ago was gone. You shouldn't have touched that. He meant the chain. His voice was so low she felt it more than heard it. His eyes were locked on hers and there was no warmth in them at all. Nola was shaking. Her back was pressed against cold concrete and the most feared man in Detroit was close enough that she could see the scar peeking out from under his collar. Tears were building behind her eyes but she held them there. She would not cry in front of this man. She would not. She told him everything. The tremor she had noticed in his hand, the discoloration on his lips, the specific glassiness in his eyes that matched thallium accumulation patterns she had studied in her toxicology module. She told him she was a biology student at Wayne State. She told him she had first noticed the symptoms 3 days ago and had spent every shift since trying to figure out what to do. She told him she was scared and she did not want to be part of his world and she had no interest in his money or his attention and she had only walked up to him because she could not stand behind that bar and watch a man die slowly when she knew what was happening. Her voice broke on the last part. Just barely. Just enough. Beck stared at her for a long time. He was reading everything. Her breathing. Her pupils. The way her hands were trembling at her sides. He was deciding whether she was telling the truth or whether this was the most elaborate setup he had ever seen. He stepped back. He picked up the clean drink she had brought him. He smelled it. He looked at her. If you're lying, you won't leave this building. Nola swallowed hard. If I'm lying, you'll be dead in 3 weeks anyway. Something passed through his face. It wasn't a smile. It was closer to recognition. Like he was looking at someone who had just said the only honest thing he had heard in months. He said nothing else. He turned and walked back through the staff door. Nola stayed pressed against the wall with her hands shaking and her heart beating so hard it hurt her ribs. She drove home that night with both hands white-knuckled on the steering wheel. Her apartment was small, 2nd floor of a duplex in Corktown. She walked in and Jonah was sitting on the couch eating a bowl of cereal at midnight, watching a documentary about deep-sea creatures with the volume too loud. He looked up at her. He took one long look at her face and said, "You look like you committed a felony." Nola dropped her keys on the counter and pressed her back against the refrigerator and let out a laugh that was halfway to a sob. "I think I touched someone I wasn't supposed to." Jonah raised an eyebrow. "Physically or emotionally?" "Both." He nodded slowly like this was a perfectly normal thing for a Tuesday night and went back to his cereal. Nola stood there for a long time, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince herself that what she had just done was the right thing and that the trembling in her body would stop eventually. It didn't. The next morning, Beck Harlan sat in the back of a black sedan outside a private clinic on the east side of Detroit. His personal doctor ran a full blood panel. Extended toxicology screen. Heavy metals. Trace compounds. The kind of test you don't order unless you already suspect the answer. The results came back 4 hours later. Low-dose thallium traces. Cumulative. Consistent with repeated exposure over several weeks. Exactly what a third-year biology student had whispered in his ear in a dark lounge while her fingers were wrapped around his dead father's chain. Beck sat in his office that evening with the report open on his desk. The room was dark. He hadn't turned the lights on. The chain hung around his neck and he reached up and pressed his thumb against the link where her fingers had been. He could still feel the warmth of it. The way she had pulled it toward her like she was pulling him back from something he couldn't see. He didn't confront anyone. He didn't call his men. He didn't move against Frank or anyone else at the table. Not yet. He picked up his phone and called one number. The only instruction he gave was 5 words. Find out everything about her. 2 days passed. Nola went to class. She went to work. She poured drinks and kept her head down and tried to pretend that the most terrifying night of her life had just been a bad dream. She avoided the corner booth when she walked the floor. She didn't look for him. But she thought about him constantly. The way the smile had died on his face. The way he had pinned her against the wall with his forearm near her head and she had been scared enough to cry but angry enough not to. The way he had said, "You shouldn't have touched that," and meant the chain but also meant something else she couldn't name yet. On the third day, she was walking across campus after her afternoon lab when a black car pulled up beside her on the street. Tinted windows. Engine idling. A man she had never seen before stepped out of the passenger side and opened the rear door. "Mr. Harlan would like to see you." Nola kept walking. "No thank you." The car rolled alongside her slowly. The man walked next to her, matching her pace. "It's not a request, ma'am." "It is now." She didn't look at him. She kept her eyes forward and her pace steady, even though her heartbeat was doing something violent against her sternum. The car stopped. The man stood still. Pause. Then a hand reached out of the rear window holding a folded piece of paper. Not printed. Handwritten. Heavy paper, dark ink, the kind of penmanship that belonged to someone who had learned to write with intention. She took it. She opened it. "You were right. I need to know what else you see." No signature. No name. She didn't need one. She recognized the weight of it immediately. The same weight she had felt when his eyes had changed in the booth. The same weight she had felt when his forearm had been near her head in that cold corridor. She stood on the sidewalk for 10 seconds. A campus bus passed behind her. A group of students laughed somewhere in the distance. The world was normal and bright and completely unaware that a 22-year-old biology student was standing at the edge of something she would never be able to walk back from. She got in the car. She hated herself for it. The estate sat on 14 acres north of the city. Stone walls, iron gates, a long gravel driveway lined with trees that had been there longer than anyone alive. The house itself was enormous and cold in the way that expensive things are cold. Everything was clean. Everything was placed with precision. There were no family photos on the walls. No warmth in the hallways. Just space and silence and the faint smell of cedar. Beck was waiting for her in a room that looked like an office but felt like a courtroom. He was standing near the window with his hands in his pockets and the late afternoon light cutting across his jaw. He looked different here. Less performance. More real. The suit jacket was off. The sleeves were rolled to his forearms. There was a tiredness in his eyes that she hadn't seen in the lounge. The kind of tired that doesn't come from lack of sleep but from years of never being able to close your eyes around the people closest to you. He told her the blood work had confirmed everything she said. Thallium. Low dose. Repeated. Weeks of exposure. He told her someone in his inner circle was doing this and he didn't know who. He told her his men were loyal to the operation, not necessarily to him, and he couldn't trust any of them to investigate without the poisoner finding out. He needed someone from outside. Someone the poisoner wouldn't suspect. Someone who could watch, observe, and notice things the way she had noticed them from behind the bar. He offered her money. A number that would have made Nola's knees buckle if she had let it. Enough to cover Jonah's school for years. Enough to pay her tuition. Enough to leave the bar and never pour another drink for a man she was afraid of. She shook her head. "I don't want your money. I want to go home." Beck turned from the window and looked at her. "You touched my chain in front of 40 people. You whispered in my ear. You walked me out through the staff door. Every person in that room saw your face. You don't get to go home and pretend this didn't happen." The words landed in her chest like cold water. She hadn't thought about that. She had been so focused on getting to him, on delivering the warning, that she hadn't considered what the performance would look like to everyone watching. To them, she was the bartender who had flirted with Beck Harlan boldly enough to pull him away from Maren Cole. That made her visible. That made her a name on lips she didn't want to be on. "So what are you saying?" she asked. "I'm saying the safest place for you right now is where I can see you." She stared at him. He stared back. Neither of them blinked for a long time. Before she could answer, the sound of heels on marble echoed through the hallway. The door opened and Maren Cole walked in like she had been born inside these walls. She wore a white dress that fit her like armor and her eyes swept the room in one clean motion. They landed on Nola. And everything in her expression hardened. She didn't make a scene. She was too smart for that. She walked past Beck, ran her fingers along his shoulder as she passed, and stopped directly in front of Nola. Close. Too close. The kind of distance that was designed to make a smaller woman step back. Nola didn't step back. She wanted to. But she didn't. Maren smiled. It was the kind of smile that didn't reach her eyes and wasn't supposed to. "So you're the bartender." "I am." "Must be exciting. Getting attention from a man like him. Girls like you usually don't get this far past the bar." Nola felt the heat rise in her neck. "I'm not here for attention." Maren tilted her head slightly. "That's what makes you dangerous, sweetheart. The ones who say they don't want it are the ones who take the most." She held Nola's gaze for 3 more seconds. Then she turned, kissed Beck on the jaw like she was marking territory, and walked out of the room without another word. Her heels echoed down the hallway like a countdown to something Nola couldn't see yet but could already feel pressing against her chest. Beck watched Maren leave. He didn't react. He didn't apologize for her. He turned back to Nola and his expression hadn't changed at all. Like that entire interaction had been background noise in a room full of it. "So," he said, "are you staying or not?" Nola looked at the door Maren had walked through. She looked at the chain hanging around Beck's neck. She looked at the window where the last light of the day was disappearing behind the trees. She thought about Jonah eating cereal alone on the couch. She thought about the man on his knees with blood on his teeth. She thought about the tremor in Beck's hand and the way the world would keep spinning whether he was alive or dead and how she was maybe the only person on this earth who had noticed that he was dying. "I'm not staying for you," she said quietly. "I'm staying because I already started this and I don't know how to walk away from something I started." Beck looked at her for a moment longer than necessary. Something shifted behind his eyes. Something small and involuntary that he covered almost instantly. "That'll do," he said. And that was how Nola Beckett, a 22-year-old biology student from Corktown who had never held a weapon or broken a law or kissed a man she was afraid of, walked into the most dangerous house in Detroit and agreed to stay. Nola started spending her days at the estate under the cover of being a personal assistant. She sat in the corners of rooms during private dinners. She stood near the kitchen during meetings. She watched who poured Beck's drinks, who prepared his food, who had access to the bottles he kept in his office. She carried a small notebook in her back pocket and filled it with names, times, and patterns that no one else in the building was paying attention to. Beck watched her work. He noticed things about her that had nothing to do with the investigation. The way she tilted her head when she was concentrating. The way she remembered small details from conversations she had overheard 2 days earlier. The way she moved through his house like she was trying to take up as little space as possible, like she was apologizing for existing in a world that wasn't hers. She noticed things about him too. The way he rubbed his left wrist when he was tired. The way he never touched his food until everyone else at the table had started eating. The way he stood near windows with his weight slightly forward, like a man who was always measuring the distance between himself and the nearest exit. They didn't talk about any of it. They didn't need to. Two people studying each other across rooms full of dangerous men, pretending the only thing between them was a job. On the fourth day, Jonah showed up at the estate unannounced because Nola had left her phone at home. He walked through the front door with his backpack hanging off one shoulder, looked at the marble floors, the security cameras, the two men in suits standing near the staircase, and stopped in the middle of the foyer. "So you're either dating a drug lord or you got a really good Groupon." Beck was coming down the hallway when he heard it. He stopped walking. And for the first time since Nola had known him, he laughed. It was short and involuntary, like his body had done it before his brain could stop it. He looked almost surprised by the sound of his own voice. Jonah turned and looked at him. 16 years old, 5'8", cereal stain on his sleeve, and completely unimpressed by the man standing in front of him. He extended his hand. "I'm the brother. Just so you know, if she disappears, I know your address now." Beck shook it. His grip was firm and his eyes stayed on Jonah's face for a long moment. He respected this kid. Nola could see it immediately. Jonah looked at Nola. "You good?" "I'm good." "Cool. Your phone's on the kitchen counter. Also, we're out of milk." He turned and walked back out the front door like he had just stopped by a friend's apartment and not a 14-acre estate owned by the most dangerous man in the city. Beck watched him leave. Then he looked at Nola. Something warm and unfamiliar passed through his expression before he buried it and walked away without saying a word. That night, Nola was sitting at the kitchen island going through her notes when Beck came in. It was past midnight. The house was silent. He didn't say anything. He just pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. She had made 2 cups of tea. She didn't know why. She hadn't planned it. She just had. She pushed one across the island toward him. He looked at the cup. Then at her. He wrapped his hand around it slowly. Their fingers were close enough that she could feel the warmth coming off his skin. Neither of them moved. Neither of them pulled away. "You should sleep more," she said quietly. "You should stop telling me what to do. Someone has to." The silence that followed those words was heavier than anything either of them had said out loud. He was looking at her in a way that made her feel like she was standing under a light she couldn't turn off. Like he was seeing something in her that he hadn't allowed himself to look at in years. He stood up. He left the room. He didn't say goodnight. Nola sat there for a long time, her hands wrapped around her own cup, her heart beating in a rhythm that felt new and terrifying and completely out of her control. 3 days later, Nola received a letter from Wayne State University. Her scholarship was under financial review. Her aid had been flagged for an audit that could take months to resolve, and during that time her tuition payments would be suspended. She read the letter twice in the parking lot outside the campus library. Her hands were steady, but her chest felt like someone had poured concrete into it. Without that scholarship she couldn't pay for school. Without school she couldn't finish her degree. Without her degree she had nothing. She didn't know it was Maren. She didn't know that Maren had a connection on the university's financial board and had made a single phone call to flag Nola's file. She didn't know any of that. But Beck did. He found out within 24 hours. He made one call. The audit disappeared. The scholarship was reinstated. Nola got a follow-up email the next morning apologizing for the administrative error. She never knew who fixed it. She never knew it had been broken on purpose. But something shifted in Beck after that. He wasn't just watching Nola for information anymore. He was watching the space around her. He was watching who had access to her life outside the estate. He was protecting something that had nothing to do with the investigation and everything to do with the woman sitting at his kitchen island at midnight making tea for a man she was supposed to be afraid of. 2 weeks in, Nola sat down across from Beck in his office and told him what she had found. She laid out the patterns. The timing of his symptoms matched the nights Frank Duvall had been present. Frank had unsupervised access to Beck's private bar. Frank was the only person at the table who never drank from the same bottle Beck did. Every data point she had collected over 14 days pointed in one direction. Beck's face went completely still. Frank Duvall had been with him for 20 years. Since before the Empire. Since his father was still alive. Frank had stood beside Beck at his father's funeral. Frank had helped him build everything he had. Frank was the closest thing to family that Beck had left. He looked at Nola's notes. He looked at the timeline. He looked at the patterns she had drawn with careful, precise handwriting on the pages of her small notebook. "Stop," he said. Nola blinked. "What?" "Stop. You're wrong. Frank has been with me since the beginning. Beck, the timeline matches perfectly. Every single episode lines up with..." I said stop. His voice was low and hard and final. He stood up from the desk. "You're a bartender with a biology textbook. You don't know my world. You don't know these people. Stay in your lane." Nola stared at him. She could feel the hurt rising in her throat, but she swallowed it and stood up and met his eyes. "I grabbed your chain to save your life. Don't ask me to watch you die because you're afraid of the truth." He said nothing. His jaw was clenched so tight she could see the muscle jumping beneath his skin. She walked out. She drove home. She didn't come back the next day. Or the day after that. She returned to her shifts at the vault. She went back to class. She poured drinks and studied for exams and made dinner for Jonah and tried to convince herself that the last 2 weeks had been a detour and not a destination. But she couldn't stop thinking about him. The way he had wrapped his hand around the teacup. The way he had laughed when Jonah walked in. The way he said, "You shouldn't have touched that," the first night in the corridor, and she had heard threat in his voice but also something underneath it that sounded like a man who hadn't been touched by anyone who wasn't trying to take something from him in a very long time. Beck, meanwhile, sat in his office and ran the test himself. He set a trap. A marked bottle. A watched moment. He invited Frank for a drink. He left the room for 4 minutes. When he came back, the seal on the bottle had been broken. He had the contents tested. Thallium. Beck sat alone in his office for a long time after that. He didn't call anyone. He didn't break anything. He reached up and pressed his thumb against the chain around his neck and held it there like he was trying to feel something through the metal that he couldn't feel anywhere else. The girl from the bar had been right about everything. And he had sent her away. He removed Frank the next morning. There was no confrontation. No raised voice. No violence. Frank arrived at the estate and found 2 men waiting for him at the door. They handed him a single envelope. Inside was a 1-page document that severed every financial and operational tie he had to Beck's organization. 20 years of loyalty and betrayal, reduced to a single piece of paper. Frank looked at the document. He looked at the house. He looked at the men standing in front of him. He understood. He turned and walked down the gravel driveway and got into his car and drove away. Beck watched from the second-floor window. He didn't feel victory. He felt the kind of grief that comes from learning that the people who raised you are sometimes the same people who decide when you die. That evening, Beck Harlan walked into the vault. He didn't go to the VIP section. He didn't sit in his corner booth. He walked to the bar, pulled out a stool, and sat down in front of Nola like he was any other customer in the room. She saw him and her hands stopped moving. The glass she was holding hovered in midair for a full second before she set it down. He didn't say anything dramatic. He didn't open with an apology wrapped in excuses. He just looked at her and said, "You were right. About all of it." She held his gaze. "I know." Pause. The lounge hummed around them. "I should have listened." "Yeah, you should have." Another pause. Longer this time. He was looking at his hands on the bar like he was trying to find words in a language he had never learned. "I don't know how to do this," he said. He didn't mean the conversation. He meant trust. He meant letting someone stand close enough to see the parts of him that weren't built for survival. He meant whatever was sitting between them in the silence of this bar that neither of them had been brave enough to name. "Neither do I," she said. That was all. No grand confession. No dramatic gesture. Just two people standing on opposite sides of a bar admitting that they were terrified of the same thing. But Maren Cole was watching from across the room. And what she saw made her dangerous in a way she hadn't been before. She found out within days that Frank had been removed and that Nola had been the one who identified him. The realization hit her like a door slamming shut. Nola wasn't just a temporary distraction. Nola had become the person who saved Beck's life. The person he trusted. The person he came back to. Maren had spent 2 years sitting beside him and she had never once been the person he walked toward when something actually mattered. She made her move on a Wednesday. She arranged for 2 men connected to a business associate of hers to intercept Nola outside her apartment building. They cornered her near the stairwell. They didn't touch her. They didn't need to. One of them leaned close and told her that she was playing in a world she didn't understand and that the smartest thing she could do was disappear from Beck Harlan's life before disappearing became something that happened to her instead of something she chose. Nola's hands were shaking. Her back was against the wall of her own building and her keys were digging into her palms so hard they left marks. She didn't call Beck. She called Jonah first and told him to lock the door and stay inside. Then she looked at the 2 men standing in front of her and she said, "I heard you. Now move." They looked at each other. They stepped aside. She walked past them and up the stairs and into her apartment and locked the door and stood in the hallway with her hand over her mouth until the shaking stopped. When Beck found out what Maren had done, the temperature in his chest dropped to something sub-zero. He didn't discuss it with her privately. He didn't give her a warning. He waited until his next gathering, a dinner at the estate with his full inner circle present, and he walked to where Maren was sitting. He placed a single key on the table in front of her. The key to the apartment he had given her 2 years ago. "This is over. And if you go near her again, I won't be this quiet about it." Maren stared at the key. Her face didn't break the way Nola expected. It hardened. The kind of hardness that comes from a woman who had built her entire identity around being chosen and had just been unchosen in front of every person who mattered. She picked up the key. She stood. She walked out without a word. The click of her heels on the marble was the only sound in the room for a long time. Beck didn't watch her leave. He turned and walked back to the head of the table and sat down and continued the evening as if nothing had changed. But everyone in that room understood exactly what had happened. He had chosen. Publicly. Irreversibly. And the woman he had chosen wasn't even in the building. A few days later, Nola came to the estate to collect the last of her notes. She was leaving. The job was done. Frank was gone. Beck was safe. There was no reason for her to keep walking through these hallways that had never belonged to her. Beck walked her to the front door. They stood in the doorway with the evening air coming through and the gravel driveway stretching out in front of them like a long sentence neither of them wanted to finish. Nola looked at his chest. At the chain. "I never apologized for grabbing that," she said quietly. He looked at her. He reached behind his neck. His fingers found the clasp. He unhooked the chain slowly and held it out to her in his open palm. The silver caught the last light of the day. "You shouldn't have touched that," he said. 3rd time. But his voice was nothing like the first time he had said it. It was soft. Open. Stripped of everything that had made him the most feared man in the city. He sounded like a man standing in a doorway holding the only thing his father ever gave him, offering it to a woman who had saved his life with shaking hands and a whispered sentence. Nola looked at the chain in his hand. She reached forward. But instead of taking it, she closed his fingers around it gently and held his fist between both of her palms. "Keep it. I don't need your chain. I just need you to stop almost dying." He looked at her hands on his. He didn't pull away. She didn't either. He leaned forward. Forehead to forehead. Eyes closed. Breathing. The space between them was so small that she could feel his heartbeat through his knuckles. Neither of them moved. Neither of them spoke. The gravel driveway was silent and the trees were still, and somewhere in the city a man who had been poisoning Beck Harlan was driving away from everything he had ever built, and a woman who had tried to destroy Nola was walking out of a life she had never truly owned. But here in this doorway none of that existed. Just two people. Standing still. Finally not running from the thing that had been pulling them together since the night she wrapped her fingers around a dead man's chain and whispered the truth into the ear of his son. Months later. A Sunday morning. Nola's apartment in Corktown. Jonah was at the stove making pancakes that smelled like they were losing the war against the bottom of the pan. Nola was at the kitchen table with a textbook open and a highlighter between her teeth. The front door opened. Beck walked in carrying 2 cups of coffee. He set one down in front of Nola without being asked. He knew her order. He had known it for a while now. Jonah looked over his shoulder. "You know you don't live here, right?" Beck sat down at the table. "You know your pancakes are burnt, right?" Jonah grinned and turned back to the stove. Nola looked at Beck over the edge of her textbook. He was wearing the chain. She noticed something she hadn't seen before. A second link had been added. Small. Almost invisible. Welded onto the original chain near the clasp. It was new. It was deliberate. And he hadn't mentioned it. She didn't ask what it meant. She reached over and touched it once, lightly, with the tip of her finger. The metal was warm from his skin. "You shouldn't have touched that," he murmured. But he was smiling. A real one. The kind of smile that reached his eyes and stayed there. She smiled back. The pancakes burned. Jonah cursed. Beck handed him a spatula without looking. Nola went back to her textbook with her coffee warming her hands and the sound of 2 people she loved arguing about breakfast filling the small apartment that had never felt this full before. The chain hung around his neck. 2 links now. One from his father. One from her. And the man who had built an empire on silence and control sat in a tiny kitchen in Corktown on a Sunday morning and let himself be loud enough to laugh.